An artillery fuse. A fuse is the type of munition fuse used with artillery munitions, typically projectiles fired by guns, howitzers and mortars. A fuse is a device that initiates an explosive function in a munition, most commonly causing it to detonate or release its contents, when its activation conditions are met. This action typically occurs a preset time after firing or on physical contact with a detected proximity to the ground, a structure or other target. Fuse, a variant of fuse, is the official NATO spelling. Terminology: munitions fuses are also used with rockets, aircraft bombs, guided missiles, grenades and mines, and some direct-fire cannon munitions. Broadly, fuses function on impact or at a predetermined time period after firing. However, by the 18th century, time fuses were aimed to function in the air, and in the 1940s proximity fuses were introduced to achieve more precisely positioned airburst. Therefore, the terms percussion and airburst are generally used here unless time fuses are being explicitly described. Early history: solid cannonballs did not need a fuse, but hollow balls filled with something, such as gunpowder, to fragment the ball hopefully on the target needed a time fuse. Early reports of shells include Venetian use at Jadra in 1376 and shells with fuses at the 1421 siege of St. Boniface in Corsica. In 1596, Sebastian Halle proposed both igniting the bursting charge by percussion and regulating the burning time of fuses. This was considered visionary, and nothing much happened until 1682. These early time fuses used a combustible material that burned for a time before igniting the shell filling. The problem was that precise burning times required precise time measurement and recording, which did not appear until 1672. Before this, the proof master often tested the burning time of powder by reciting the Apostles' Creed for time measurement. It was not until around the middle of the following century that it was realized that the windage between ball and barrel allowed the flash from the propelling charge to pass around the shell. This led, in 1747, to single fire and eliminated the need to light the fuse before loading the shell. At this time, fuses were made of beechwood, bored out and filled with powder and cut to the required length. Experience taught that there was a minimum safe length. In 1779, the British adopted pre-cut fuse lengths, giving for 4.5 and 5 seconds. The first account of a percussion fuse appears in 1650, using a flint to create sparks to ignite the powder. The problem was that the shell had to fall a particular way, and with spherical shells this could not be guaranteed. The term "blind" for an unexploded shell resulted. The problem was finding a suitably stable percussion powder. Progress was not possible until the discovery of mercury fulminate in 1800, leading to priming mixtures for small arms patented by the Rev. Alexander Forsyth, and the copper percussion cap in 1818. The concept of percussion fuses was adopted by Britain in 1842. Many designs were jointly examined by the Army and Navy, but were unsatisfactory, probably because of the safety and arming features. However, in 1846 the design by Quartermaster Freeburn of the Royal Artillery was adopted by the Army. It was a wooden fuse some 6 inches long and used shear wire to hold blocks between the fuse magazine and a burning match. The match was ignited by propellant flash and the shear wire broke on impact. A British naval percussion fuse, made of metal, did not appear until 1861. There was little standardization. Well into the 19th century, in British service, virtually every caliber had its own time fuse. For example, 7 different fuses were used with spherical cased shot until 1850. However, in 1829 metal fuses were adopted by the Royal Navy instead of wooden ones. At this time fuses were used with shrapnel, common shell and grenades. All British fuses were prepared by cutting to length or boring into the bottom from below. The problem was that this left the powder unsupported and fuse failures were common. The indefatigable Colonel Boxer suggested a better way: wooden fuse cones with a central powder channel and holes drilled every 2/10 of an inch. There were white and black painted fuses for odd and even tenths. Clay prevented the powder spilling out. In 1853 these were combined into a single fuse with dual channels, 2 inches long for howitzers and common shell, 1 inch for shrapnel. However, while the Boxer-time fuse was a great advance, various problems had to be dealt with over the following years. It also used a different fuse hole size to Freeburn's percussion fuse, which became obsolete. They were replaced in Army service in 1861 by those designed by Mr. Petman. These could be used with both spherical and non-spherical shells. The final Boxer-time fuse, for mortars, appeared in 1867, and the Army retained wooden fuses, although the Navy used metal ones. There was a similar American wooden fuse. However, in 1855 Armstrong produced his rifled breech loading gun, which was introduced into British service in 1859. The problem was that there was little or no windage between the shell and the barrel, so the propelling charge could no longer be used to ignite the fuse. Therefore, a primer was added with a hammer suspended above it. The shock of firing released the hammer, which initiated the primer to ignite the powder time train. Armstrong's A-pattern time fuse was introduced to British service in 1860, and the shorter length Borman fuses in the United States. The introduction of RBL guns led to non-spherical projectiles, which landed nose first. This enabled percussion nose fuses, but they had to cope with the spinning shell and centrifugal forces. This led, by about 1870, to percussion fuses with a direct action firing pin and detonator and a magazine to boost the detonators sufficiently to initiate the shell's main charge. Armstrong's time fuse designs evolved rapidly. In 1867 the F-pattern was introduced. This was the first time an percussion fuse. Its percussion function was not entirely successful and was soon replaced by the EMK-A3 fuse. Made of brass, it contained a ring of slow-burning composition ignited by a pellet holding a detonator cap that was set back onto a firing pin by the shock of firing. It was the prototype of the T and AMP-P fuses used in the 20th century, although initially it was only used with naval segment shells, and it took some time for the Army to adopt it for shrapnel. Description: since the second half of the 19th century, most artillery fuses are fitted to the nose of the projectile. The base of the fuse is screwed into a recess, and its nose is designed to conform to the shape of the shell's ogive. The depth of recess can vary with the type of shell and fuse. Artillery fuses were sometimes specific to particular types of gun or howitzer due to the characteristics. Notable differences in muzzle velocity and hence the sensitivity of safety and AMP arming mechanisms. However, by World War II, while there were exceptions, most fuses of one nation could be used with any required artillery shell of the nation, if it could be physically fitted to it, although different Army and Navy procurement arrangements often prevented this. The exceptions were mortar bomb fuses, and this continues. An early action in NATO standardization was to agree the dimensions and threads of the fuse recess in artillery projectiles to enable fuse interchangeability between nations. Modern artillery fuses can generally be used with any appropriate artillery shell, including naval ones. However, smoothbore mortars constrain the choice of safety and arming mechanisms because there is no centrifugal force and muzzle velocities are relatively low. Therefore, shell fuses cannot be used with mortar bombs, and mortar fuses are unsuitable for the higher velocities of shells. The fuse action is initiated by impact, elapsed time after firing, proximity to a target. In most cases, the fuse action causes detonation of the main high explosive charge in a shell or a small charge to eject a carrier shell's contents. These contents may be lethal, such as the now obsolete shrapnel shell or modern sub-munitions, or non-lethal such as canisters containing a smoke compound or a parachute flare. Fuses normally have two explosive components in their explosive train: a very small detonator struck by a firing pin, and a booster charge at the base of the fuse. This booster is powerful enough to detonate the main charge in a high explosive shell or the ejecting charge in a carrier shell. The two charges are typically connected by a flash tube. The safety and arming arrangements in artillery fuses are critical features to prevent the fuse functioning until required. No matter how harsh its transport and handling, these arrangements use the forces created by the gunner howitzer firing, high acceleration and rotation, to release the safety features and arm the fuse. Some older types of fuse also had safety features such as pins or caps removed by the user before loading the shell into the breech. Defective fuses can function while the shell is in the barrel, or premature, or further along the trajectory. Different fuse designs have different safety and arming mechanisms that use the two forces in various ways. The earliest modern fuses used wire sheared by the shock of firing. Subsequently, centripetal devices were generally preferred for use with low-velocity howitzer shells because the setback was often insufficient. However, late 19th and 20th century designs used more sophisticated combinations of methods that applied the two forces. Examples include centripetal force moving a bolt outwards, which allows another bolt to move backwards by inertia from acceleration. Inertia from acceleration overcoming the pressure of a retaining spring to release a catch that allows an arm plate, segmented sleeve or other bolt to move outwards by centrifugal force. Centripetal force causing a plate holding a detonator to swing into alignment with the firing pin. Centripetal force causing a barrier plate to block to overcome a spring and swing out of the channel between the firing pin and detonator or between the detonator and a booster. Rotation causing a weighted tape to unwind from around a spindle and free the firing pin hammer. Modern safety and arming devices are part of an overall fuse design that meets insensitive munitions requirements. This includes careful selection of the explosives used throughout the explosive train, strong physical barriers between the detonator and booster until the shell is fired, and positioning explosive components for maximum protection in the fuse. Types of artillery fuse. Percussion fuses. In the 20th century, most fuses were percussion. They may be direct action or graze. They may also offer a delay option. Percussion fuses remain widespread, particularly for training. However, in the 19th century, combined T and P fuses became common, and this combination remained widespread with airburst fuses in case the airburst function failed or was set too long. War stocks in Western armies are now predominantly multifunction, offering a choice of several ground and airburst functions. Direct action fuses. Direct action fuses function by the fuse nose hitting something reasonably solid, such as the ground, a building or a vehicle, and pushing a firing pin into a detonator. The early British fuse set left is an example. Direct-action fuse designs are super quick but may have a delay option. 20th century designs vary in the relative positions of the key elements, the extremes being the firing pin and detonator close to the nose with a long flash tube to the booster, or a long firing pin to a detonator close to the booster and a short flash tube. Graze fuses. Graze fuses function when the shell is suddenly slowed down, e.g., by hitting the ground or going through a wall. This deceleration causes the firing pin to move forward, or the detonator to move backward, sharply and strike each other. Graze is the only percussion mechanism that can be used in base fuses. Delay fuses. Direct-action fuses can have a delay function selected at the gun as an alternative to direct action. Delay may use a graze function or some other mechanism. Special concrete piercing fuses usually have only a delay function and a hardened and strengthened fuse nose. Base fuses. Base fuses are enclosed within the base of the shell and are hence not damaged by the initial impact with the target. The delay timing may be adjustable before firing. They use graze action and have not been widely used by field artillery. Base-fused shells were used by coast artillery against armored warships into the 1950s. They have also had some use against tanks, including with high-explosive squash head, also called high-explosive plastic, used after World War II by 105 mm artillery for self-defense against tanks and by tanks. Airburst fuses. Airburst fuses, using a preset timing device initiated by the gun firing, were the earliest type of fuse. They were particularly important in the 19th and early 20th centuries when shrapnel fuses were widely used. They again became important when cluster munitions became a major element in Cold War ammunition stocks, and the moves to multifunction fuses in the late 20th century mean that in some Western countries airburst fuses are available with every shell used on operations. Time fuses were essential for larger caliber anti-aircraft guns, and it soon became clear that igniferous fuses were insufficiently accurate, and this drove the development of mechanical time fuses between the World Wars. During World War II, radio proximity fuses were introduced, initially for use against aircraft where they proved far superior to mechanical time, and at the end of 1944 for field artillery. Time fuses. Artillery time fuses detonate after a set period of time. Early time fuses were igniferous using a powder train. Clockwork mechanisms appeared at the beginning of the 20th century, and electronic time fuses appeared in the 1980s, soon after digital watches. Almost all artillery time fuses are fitted to the nose of the shell. One exception was the 1950s design US 8-inch nuclear shell that had a triple-deck mechanical time base fuse. The time length of a time fuse is usually calculated as part of the technical fire control calculations, and not done at the gun, although armies have differed in their arrangements. The fuse length primarily reflects the range to the target and the required height of burst. High height of burst, typically a few hundred meters, is usually used with star shell and other base ejecting shells such as smoke and cluster munitions, and for observing with high explosive shells in some circumstances. Low airburst, typically about 10 meters, was used with the height of burst with shrapnel depended on the angle of descent, but for optimal use it was a few tens of meters. Igniferous time fuses had a powder ring in an inverted U metal channel. The fuse was set by rotating the upper part of the fuse. When the shell was fired, the shock of firing set back a detonator onto a firing pin, which ignited the powder ring. When the burn reached the fuse setting, it flashed through a hole into the fuse magazine, which then ignited the bursting charge in the shell. If the shell contained He, then the fuse had a gainer that converted the powder explosion into a detonation powerful enough to detonate the He. The problem with igniferous fuses was that they were not very precise and somewhat erratic, but good enough for flat trajectory shrapnel or high-bursting carrier shells. While improvements in powder composition helped, there were several complex factors that prevented a high degree of regularity in the field. Britain in particular encountered great difficulty in achieving consistency early in World War I with its attempts to use its by then obsolescent gunpowder train time fuses for anti-aircraft fire against German bombers and airships which flew at altitudes up to 20,000 feet. It was then discovered that standard gunpowder burned differently at differing altitudes, and the problem was then rectified to some extent by specially designed fuses with modified gunpowder formulations. Britain finally switched to mechanical time fuses just after World War I, which solved this problem. Residual stocks of igniferous fuses lasted for many years after World War II with smoke and illuminating shells. Before World War I, Krupp, in Germany, started producing the Baker Clockwork fuse. It contained a spring clock with an extra rapid cylinder escapement giving 30 beats per second. During World War I, Germany developed other mechanical time, i.e. clockwork fuses. These were less erratic and more precise than igniferous fuses. Critical characteristics as gun ranges increased. Between the wars, 5 or 6 different mechanical mechanisms were developed in various nations. However, 3 came to predominate: the Thiel pattern in British designs, Jungen's pattern in United States, and the Swiss-Dixie mechanisms. The first 2 both originated in World War I Germany. Mechanical time fuses remain in service with many armies. Mechanical time fuses were just about good enough to use with field artillery to achieve the effective height of burst of about 10 meters above the ground. However, good enough usually meant 4 in the air and 2 on the ground. This fuse length was extremely difficult to predict with adequate accuracy, so the height of burst almost always had to be adjusted by observation. Proximity fuses. The benefits of a fuse that functioned when it detected a target in proximity are obvious, particularly for use against aircraft. The first such fuse seems to have been developed by the British in the 1930s for use with their anti-aircraft and rotated projectiles rockets. These used a photoelectric fuse. During 1940–42, a private venture initiative by Pi Limited, a leading British wireless manufacturer, worked on the development of a radio proximity fuse. Pi's research was transferred to the United States as part of the technology package delivered by the TISAD mission when the United States entered the war. These fuses emitted radio waves and sensed the reflection from the target. The strength of the reflected signal indicated the distance to the target. When this was correct, the fuse detonated. For the first 18 months, proximity fuses were restricted to anti-aircraft use to ensure that none were retrieved by the enemy and copied. They were also called variable time, or VT, to obscure their nature. They were finally released for field artillery use in December 1944 in Europe. While they were not perfect and bursts could still be erratic due to rain, they were a vast improvement on mechanical time in delivering a very high proportion of bursts at the required 10 meters height. However, VT fuses went far deeper into the shell than other fuses because they had a battery that was activated by the shock of firing. This meant the fuse recess had to be deeper, so to enable shorter non-VT fuses, the deep recess was filled with removable supplementary heat canisters. After the war, the next generation of proximity fuse included a mechanical timer to switch on the fuse a few seconds before it was due at the target. These were called controlled variable time, and reduced the incidence of early bursts. Later models had additional electronic countermeasures. Distance-measuring fuses. The mechanical distance fuse has had little use. Thompson's pattern was trialled by the British but did not enter service. The fuse is operated by counting revolutions. It has the advantage of inherent safety and not requiring any internal driving force but depended on muzzle velocity and rifling pitch. However, these are allowed for when calculating the fuse setting. Early 20th century versions were sometimes called flag futzes, surnamed due to the vane protruding from the nose of the fuse. Electronic time fuses. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, electronic time fuses started replacing earlier types. These were based on the use of oscillating crystals that had been adopted for digital watches. Like watches, advances in electronics made them much cheaper to produce than mechanical devices. The introduction of these fuses coincided with the widespread adoption of cluster munitions in some NATO countries. Multifunction fuses. A fuse assembly may include more than one fuse function. A typical combination would be a T&P fuse with the fuse set to detonate on impact or expiration of a preset time, whichever occurred first. Such fuses were introduced around the middle of the 19th century. This combination may function as a safety measure or as an expedient to ensure that the shell will be actuated no matter what happens and hence not be wasted. The United States called mechanical T&P fuses mechanical time super quick. T&P fuses were normal with shrapnel and HE shells, but were not always used with high-bursting carrier shells. However, in the early 1980s, electronic fuses with several functions and options started appearing. Initially, they were little more than enhanced versions of proximity fuses, typically offering a choice proximity heights or impact options. A choice of burst heights could also be used to get optimum burst heights in terrain with different reflectivity. However, they were cheaper than older proximity fuses and the cost of adding electronic functions was marginal. This meant they were much more widely issued. In some countries, all the war stock was fitted with them, instead of only 5 to 10% with proximity fuses. The most modern multi-option artillery fuses offer a comprehensive choice of functions. For example, Jungan's DM84U provides delay, super quick time, 2 proximity heights of burst and 5 depths of foliage penetration. Sensor and course-correcting fuses. Sensor fuses can be considered smart proximity fuses. Initial developments were the United States seek and destroy armor in the 1980s using sub-munitions ejected from 203 mm carrier shell. Subsequent European developments bonus and smart 155, a 155 mm caliber due to advances in electronics. These sensor fuses typically use millimetric radar to recognize a tank and then aim the sub-munition at it and fire an explosively formed penetrator from above. The main fuse development activities in the early 21st century are course-correcting fuses. These add guidance and control functions to the standard multi-option nose fuse package. However, they are not the same as precision-guided artillery munitions and are not designed to be precise or unaffordable for widespread use.